Welcome to the Humanism Now podcast. I'm your host, James Hodgson. Katherine Stewart is an award-winning journalist and author who writes about the intersection of faith and politics, policy, and education, and the threat to democratic institutions. Katherine has been covering religious nationalism and the assault on American democracy for over 15 years. Her work has appeared in the New York Times and the New Republic. In her latest book, Money, Lies and God, Katherine delves into how religious nationalism is reshaping democracy and politics, exploring its goals and global implications. Katherine's previous work, The Power Worshippers, was awarded first place for excellence in non-fiction books by the Religious News Association and was adapted into the documentary God and Country. Her first book, The Good News Club, covered the religious right's efforts to infiltrate and undermine public education. In 2024, Katherine was awarded the Freethought Heroine Award from the Freedom of Religion Foundation. Katherine Stewart, thank you so much for joining us on Humanism Now.
Thank you so much for having me.
So it's quite an impressive list of work and publications that you've written around this topic of the separation of church and state, but also the rise of religious nationalism, particularly in the US. I'm interested to know when you first began to suspect that faith was being used as a threat to democratic institutions, and what drew you to this area of research?
Well, I first got interested in this topic 16 years ago when a program of fundamentalist religious indoctrination called a Good News Club forced its way into our daughter's public elementary school. Public schools are state schools in the United States. And we do have a constitutional principle of separation of church and state. So faith schools, we have plenty of faith schools, but they're not supposed to be funded by the government. The state schools are meant to be non-sectarian, neither denigrating nor promoting any particular form of religion. But this program I discovered was really confusing little children into believing that their school endorsed this particular form of religion. And then they were using that misperception among children as young as 5 and 6 years old who are attending the clubs. They would instruct them specifically to try to recruit their peers to the club. And a lot of the kids who were attending the clubs would approach their, say, non-Christian peers or peers who were perhaps Catholic or the wrong kind of Christian and say, I know this must be true because they taught it to me in school. State schools have a kind of cloak of authority in the minds of children. So I was really shocked to discover that the people who ran this club, it's called the Good News Club, they were calling our public schools their mission fields. And they were calling other people's children the harvest. And I couldn't help but wonder, what are they really after? So I followed that thread. I found the topic was much bigger than I imagined. The important thing that I've observed over time is how much that movement has really evolved. I discovered that these initiatives were national initiative. There were thousands of these clubs in our state schools, but they were just one small part of a much larger attack on state education as a non-sectarian institution. And the attack on state education was just one small part of a much broader attack on the foundations of a modern secular democracy. So what I discovered over time is that the core ideology hasn't changed. It's been 16 years now since I started researching this, but the appeal and strategy has really broadened to a massive degree, and its influence on one of America's two major political parties is now indisputable. It's really taken over. And what we're seeing now with the incoming Trump administration is just the infusion of religious nationalism or Christian nationalism in many areas of government.
And how far back does the Christian nationalist movement go? And who are the key players in its foundation or developing it to the prominence it's at now?
The roots run very deep through multiple periods of history. But this movement, as it exists in contemporary form, really got its start in the, late 1970s, early 1980s, with the rise of a movement called the New Right. Members of this group were really upset about changes in American society, including racial integration. They were really upset about the civil rights movement, desegregation, the women's rights movement, a sort of nascent gay rights movement, et cetera. And they also felt that the Republican Party itself, which was typically the conservative party, had become too liberal and too soft on communism. They were really affected by Cold War politics. They also felt that American religion was frankly becoming too moderate because of the rise of certain sort of moderate theologians. And they started to meet and talk about how they could turn the situation around. And there's frankly a fascinating episode where they got together and basically went down a laundry list of the issues that they thought could unite their new movement. So we're talking like 1980 or so. This is about 7 years after the passage of Roe versus Wade, which legalized and liberalized abortion law. So number one was the fear that private religious schools, many of which were run by these very reactionary preachers, and they were racially segregated. Some of them had actually called segregation scriptural. They said it's God's established order. But the tax authorities in the United States were looking at these racially segregated schools and think, why are we giving you tax privileges? And this was outrageous to them. They thought, we don't want to be taxed for our segregation, our racial segregation. That really was a huge animating issue for some of the preachers who were part of this coalition. Another big issue for them was the women's rights movement. It was appalling that women were stepping out of their lane. But there were several other issues on the list. School prayer, the absence of school prayer, but they had ultra-conservative Catholic sort of collaborators, and the issue of school prayer tended to upset them because of a sort of history, Catholic-Protestant clashes around the issues of school prayer. And they went down these issues one by one, but they came to the issue of abortion, which was hardly at the top of their list. And it was like a light bulb went off. So they were like, that could possibly work, because it touched on a range of anxieties, including anxieties about gender and even anxieties about race, the idea that the supposedly wrong kind of Americans were procreating and, as they might think, changing the complexion, as it were, of America. So conservative-leaning Americans over time have really been persuaded that abortion is the single most important issue when it comes to their vote. Leaders of this movement know very well, if you can get people to vote on a single issue or one or two issues, you can control their vote. So that is really how they coalesce their movement. It's how they message to the rank and file. It really took a long time to get the Republican Party to become anti-abortion. I mean, when Roe versus Wade had passed, the Southern Baptist Convention actually hailed the decision as a sensible middle ground. Barry Goldwater, a great conservative hero, supported abortion law liberalization, at least early in his career. Many Protestant Republicans felt like this sort of conformed to Protestant middle-class values, the idea of choosing when and if to become pregnant. But over time, these pro-choice voices were really purged from the Republican Party. And now the Republican Party is entirely A to Z. They call themselves a party of life. But it's almost like the theology had to change. So the pro-life religion that we see today, it's a modern creation. It was created for political purposes.
I think that's the really fascinating strand that you draw out in the book. And I know you came to give us a talk at the London Humanists as well. And I think that was the thing that stood out for me the most, the idea that this is really not that much about the religious side at all, or it's a political movement which uses religion as a tool.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people who are convinced that abortion is the greatest moral issue of our time are really not aware of the sort of history of it. This activist that you may have heard of named Phyllis Schlafly, she was part of that New Right. She wrote a book called How the Republican Party Became Pro-Life. And what it shows is that here is one of these key anti-abortion activists who actually wrote a book about how hard it was to purge those pro-choice voices and really get this party to unite around this single issue so they can use it as a sort of voter turnout tool. But you should be aware that there is also a nascent anti-abortion movement here in the UK, and they're also relying on some US-based organizations for key parts of their support.
Yeah, I'd love to come on actually to some of the global implications of this, as you say, whilst it may have started in America, how it's spreading around the world. But I'm interested as well in terms of how is Christian nationalism perceived amongst the wider Christian population in America? Presumably they don't speak for all Christians in what is predominantly a Christian country.
It's very interesting. Christianity in America is incredibly diverse, like every other religion. And I think the way many, if not most, American Christians understand their faith has to do with social justice, loving their neighbor, caring for the least of these. The way I do a lot of my research is I go to right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings. And last December, I went to this gathering in Phoenix, Arizona called America Fest. It's sponsored by Turning Point USA, which is one of the most politically engaged organizations. They have a big voter turnout component. And one of the speakers there, he's the head of Turning Point Faith, which is their faith outreach arm. His name is Lucas Miles. He wrote a book. I mean, his whole thing is about how terrible, he calls it woke Jesus is heresy destroying the American church. And he actually literally took aim at the social gospel. And he said the historical Jesus movement and liberation theology and Black liberation theology. And he said he and some 3,500 other pastors are forming what he called a new Nicene Creed or Council. He was referring to the 4th century entity that sort of fixed some of the key doctrines of Christianity. And he said, we need to decide, paraphrasing here, which Jesus is the right Jesus, acknowledging that he was talking about wokeism from the pulpit. We need to eradicate wokeism from the pulpit. What does wokeism mean? It's anything having to do with empathy. It has having to do with the social gospel, which is, of course, a key feature of Christianity in America and among many American Christians and also among many Christians around the world. So I just think it's fascinating that some of the most poisonous words are reserved for Christians who happen to adhere to a different version of religion. And there are many progressive and moderate and liberal pastors who are speaking out against this. I think of groups like the Baptist Joint Committee and Christians Against Christian Nationalism or Vote Common Good, the New Evangelicals. There are so many, but these are not equivalent movements, the sort of moderate and progressive Christian voices that are speaking out against the weaponization of their faith for politics and power don't have the money, don't have the organization, they just don't have the political infrastructure. Because the Christian nationalist movement in America is a leadership-driven and an organization-driven movement. It is incredibly well-funded. It has formed alliances with a sector of the plutocratic class that wants, just bear with me for a minute, they want low taxes for the rich. They want minimal regulations of business. They say that they are pro-capitalist and they want free markets, but they're also seeking, in many instances, not only protections for their monopolistic businesses, but also taxpayer subsidies in some cases. So they want policies that are going to justify and increase their wealth at the very top. And by the way, these funders, they're not all one type. Some of them are Protestant, some are evangelical, some are Catholic, some are Jewish, some are atheist. Religiously, they're all over the place, but they want this economic agenda enacted. And how do they get the little people, right, the rank and file, to vote for this agenda that is actually eroding rights for the workforce and making life more difficult for them, making life more expensive for them, more difficult for their families? They do it through the sort of identitarian religious movement. So they're funding these billionaires, they're funding initiatives that are promoting this abortion stuff, this anti-woke stuff, this sort of stuff about the sort of trans panic stuff, which affects very few people, but they talk about it constantly as though there is nothing else more important. And you get people voting on those kinds of identity issues, then they're not paying attention to the fact that the system is actually not benefiting them. This is a movement that claims to stand for the American family, but what they're doing is driving support for politicians whose policies are actually making it so much harder for so many American families to succeed.
It's fascinating, yeah, and there's so many strands to this as well. And it sounds like from what you've explained there that there's lots of contradictions in what this movement wants compared to what I guess we would traditionally think of the teachings of the Bible and Jesus, particularly around taxes. And also just on the founding principles of the US, if we talk about freedom of belief. How do they justify these contradictions, or how do they make them seem aligned with a Christian movement?
I think to an important extent, they are in league with one another. They're rowing in the same boat, as it were. They all work together to get Trump elected. They work together to hollow out the Republican Party. and eliminate other guardrails that are supposed to protect our democracy. They are the anti-democratic movement. And just because they have different interests and ideas and say might not necessarily get along very well at a party, it doesn't mean they're not all contributing to the movement in important ways. But can they stay together? That's a really good question. In a certain sense, now that they've installed Trump as a president, I think success might be harder for them than failure, because now they have to fight one another to get Trump's ear, while before they were united in fighting the dreaded scourge of the Democrats and the left. So that begs the question, where are the fissures? I think and how can those fissures be exploited? So I think for the most obvious and concrete fissure, we have to look at the oligarchs who are funding the movement. When I'm talking about oligarchs, I'm talking about people like Barry Seid, for instance. He's a Jewish Chicago billionaire. Does Barry Seid care about same-sex marriage? Probably not. He donated $1.6 billion to form something called the Marble Freedom Trust. And he put Leonard Leo, who is one of the key activists of the movement, who's played an enormous role in pumping up the sort of right-wing legal ecosphere, in charge of it. They can spend $230 million a year without touching the sort of nut of this investment. And Leonard Leo funds a lot of these culture war issues. Or we're looking at people like the Betsy DeVos and her extended family, who are Reformed, which is a variety of sort of evangelical Christian, deeply reactionary. And she's devoted to destroying public education as we know it. So they're very different, these oligarchs. But really what they want to do is lock in their monopoly profits. Just for fun, you should Google Betsy DeVos's yachts. I mean, with an S at the end of it, or her houses. It's really an extraordinary exercise. So they want to lock in their monopoly profits. They want to prevent any kind of government oversight from their activities. Yet they still want to continue to receive these public subsidies. They want to keep labor costs down. They're also devoting Betsy DeVos, some of her vast wealth is going to break the labor unions. So meanwhile, the rank and file, broadly speaking, want exactly the opposite in terms of economics. They want a better shake for the workforce generally and the fair deal for themselves generally. And most of them want strong public education, great public schools where their children can get a fantastic education and get a fair shake in life. But these groups, in a way, the oligarchs and the rank and file, are unified at a symbolic level. Both sides pitched themselves recently as disruptors and destroyers of the regime or the status quo, whatever they call it. But as long as they remain at that level of abstraction, it holds. But once the differences in what they want can be highlighted, then we might begin to see some real tensions there. And I think we see a similar tension with the parts of the movement that sees itself as religiously driven. The funders want government off their backs, but the religious theocrats want government on everybody's back and perhaps in everybody's bedroom. So there are these deep tensions in the movement, and they can and should be highlighted and exploited.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. As you say, it seems to come down a lot to the individuals who are running the movement in terms of what their priorities are. And you bring in the third pillar of this, which is the money side of everything. And I know you have a new book coming out shortly, Money, Lies, and God, Why So Many Americans Have Turned Against Democracy. And I wonder, drawing on what you've mentioned already, or any additional themes, why do you think there has been this, what seems quite sudden shift against democracy? What are the drivers behind that?
Yeah, the shift wasn't sudden. It's been built up over the past 5 decades. And now we're seeing the consequences. When I started reporting on this movement, the big story in religion was the rise of the nuns, people who don't happen to identify with any particular religion. And I could see that the movement was investing a huge amount of money and strategy in legal strategies that were going to erode or even destroy the separation of church and state, which is really the foundation of democracy necessary for true religious freedom in a country as pluralistic and diverse as ours. I'd like to briefly summarize the reason for the title, because I think it helps us understand the different categories at work in this anti-democratic movement. The book is titled Money, Lies, and God, because, of course, money is a huge part of the story. Huge concentrations of wealth have destabilized the political system. and made a lot of Americans very anxious. And those anxieties can be easily weaponized and hurled against the perceived political enemies. Second, lies or conscious disinformation is another huge feature of the movement. Some of these funders are investing in, I can only call it a propaganda sphere or a right-wing disinformation sphere, in order to separate the rank and file from the facts, which makes them easier to control, of course. So huge numbers of Americans now believe really crazy conspiracies. QAnon, right? I don't know how big that is here, but it's a massive thing in America. We have some members of Trump's incoming administration who go along with QAnon or have actively promoted the QAnon conspiracy. They universally adhere to the idea, which is a lie, that the 2020 election was stolen. And it's funny, elections are stolen when they don't go their way, and then they have these massive riots and storm the Capitol and assault police officers. But when an election does go their way, they're like, oh, it worked. No more election fraud. And then number three, God, because I think the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this anti-democratic movement is Christian nationalism.
And with the pressures that are coming, do you foresee the institutions of democracy withstanding and holding? Do you think this is a more serious threat?
I think it's a really serious threat, but I don't, left my crystal ball in the other room. I think there are no features of the current democratic system as of yet that means that MAGA will rule indefinitely, even though they would certainly like to. They're happy to break the rules and violate the laws in order to do so. But, in a country as sort of a system as kind of sclerotic and I would say strange and rickety in some ways as ours, as sort of democracy, it takes a long time to get certain things done. Some of Trump's policies will no doubt fail because they're unimplementable. Others will fail through incompetence. Others will fail because they'll get snarled up in the courts. We have elections in 2 years and 4 years. I am really encouraged by many people that I see starting to really recognize the threat. I think that for a long time, a lot of folks were asleep at the wheel. When I, along with some other researchers, started reporting on this movement, we were often called alarmist. Well, no one is calling us alarmist anymore. So I think the first step, of course, is to really recognize what we're up against. And the 3 books that I've written, I really talk about how this movement has come to power in a really technical way. I show how the infrastructure is built, how the leadership has been able to get on the same page through these networking organizations that get the heads of these organizations on the same page. I show where the ideological alignments are as well as the fissures. And I think by understanding the movement better, we are better positioned to really mount an effective response.
And on that, how do you see this movement influencing politics more globally? Obviously, you mentioned its prominence now in the US, and we're looking at, I'm speaking to you from the UK here. We're seeing the rise of the far right across Europe and other parts of the world. Do you see the techniques of the Christian nationalist movement in the US being mirrored? Do you see it as a threat more broadly, let's say?
Yeah, there's so much to say here. But let's start with the fact that it's clear that there are parallel movements overseas that are not in America, and that parallels are not entirely coincidental. We have right-wing leaders in the US colluding with right-wing leaders abroad to advance each other's interests. So in many instances, you have US organizations planting divisions overseas and lending support in various ways to the movement abroad. But they're not doing it all by themselves. There are funders and leaders in other countries as well. And we have to keep in mind that there are nuances specific to different countries and regions. But the attack on democracy is by no means limited to the United States. I think of religious nationalism as I used for my second book, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, to make clear that there are parallels around the globe. So when you have leaders in like Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran, when these leaders are consolidating more authoritarian forms of political power, harsher, more extreme forms of restrictive political power, they'll bind themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own countries in order to bubble wrap themselves in sanctimony. They're saying, like, I've got the holy man to my right, I've got the holy man to my left, you can't touch me. And they're doing this to guard against any investigation of their crimes, the abuses they're perpetrating against their own people. And their kleptocracy and the fact that, in some instances, they're handing off pieces of the public treasury to people who are good to them, right, as a reward for their loyalty. And you can describe these countries with various nuance to various degrees as theocracies in a certain fake sense, in that their laws are based on their holy texts and everybody has to either conform or pretend to conform. But really, there are systems of authoritarian control where you have absolute suppression of free speech and absolute suppression of no real political opposition, or no chance for the political opposition to really rise and be on the same playing field.
I think that's fascinating. And how much do you see the leaders who kind of benefit from this movement, as mentioned with the returning president in the US, you mentioned others, particularly across Europe, how much do you believe that they themselves are sort of true believers, or this is an advantageous marriage of convenience?
It's a really good question. And we really can't know what's in people's hearts.
No.
It can vary. Some are more cynical than others. I might suspect more about this one or that one. I think some of them truly do believe, but that doesn't mean that they don't see it as in their interests. I mean, two things can be true at the same time. It's also, they can truly believe they're doing God's will and what's right. And then they see that it's really terrific for they're being rewarded in material ways and also rewarded by power. And they're happy about that. But those two things can go together. I think it's really important also the extent to which this world has sort of walled itself off from reason. Many of these folks exist in a kind of echo chamber where each leader is saying the same thing and they're hearing it all the time from one another. And that sort of confirms what they believe. So, they're not really letting in what might come as doubt or questions about whether what they're doing is truly good for the country, or it's a complicated picture.
Yes, as I can say. And I can imagine it's also reinforcing as well the longer you're in the movement. This time around, the rhetoric of the returning Trump, him as president, but also everyone around him, is much more religious in tone than it was the first time around. And it seems as though it's almost become more reinforcing as the movement has gone on. So with all that said, and everything that you've covered today and across obviously the books and your work over the past 15 years, what have you found to be the most effective methods to counter the rise of religious nationalism?
First of all, I take heart in the fact that more Americans support democracy and its institutions over some sort of cronyistic kleptocracy with theocratic and authoritarian features. I also meet a lot of people out there who are working every day to cut through the disinformation, polarization, and strengthen our democracy. And they really give me hope, and I think they should give all of us hope. The most effective strategies, I mean, there are just so many avenues for engagement. I think that, first of all, understanding the nature of the threat is really important so that you don't end up wasting your time, say, launching lawsuits that aren't going to go anywhere because of the way the courts are organized or because of the Supreme Court precedents and things like that. It's a good time right now to have moral courage and prepare ourselves for the challenges ahead. So we have to figure out how we do better. Familiarize yourself with a threat, recognize it when it shows up and seems like a local initiative, and you can recognize that it's part of a national initiative, and then engaging in democracy preserving initiatives in powerful and actually really productive ways. I think that sometimes there are folks who show up for a march and they think that's the extent of the kind of activism they need to engage in. Well, marches are actually, I think, it's really important to engage in broad-based actions that are more about turning out the vote, that are more about reaching people who wouldn't necessarily want to show up for a march. That might be the kind of thing that appeals to a certain sector of the professional classes. But we need to reach the ordinary American with the message that this is not in their interest. So highlighting those divisions between the oligarchs and some of the theocrats, for sure, and their own material interests day to day is really important. I think we need to be more committed and effective to turning out the base of voters who share those democratic values, who want a better deal for themselves. And we also need to work really hard to earn the trust of low propensity voters. In a country in America where 40 to 50% of people simply don't turn out to vote, and additional numbers have their votes downgraded through race-based gerrymandering. I don't know if you know what that is. It's a sort of strange way that they organized voter districts in the South in order to diminish the value of Black voters and Democratic voters. And then there are these sort of crazy laws that have passed. Oh, you can't bring people water while they're waiting in line to vote. And like in, say, a heavily Black district, they'll have lines because there aren't as many voter sites. I mean, there's all these sort of dirty tricks that the Republican Party has pursued in order to diminish the value of Black voters and Democratic voters. And it really doesn't take a majority to win elections. All it takes is a disproportionately mobilized minority. So we need to really turn out the base of voters who share democratic values and also stop allowing the right to frame the issues that we discuss. They want us to be focused on these shiny identity issues, which is a massive distraction from the much larger and more impactful policies that they are pursuing, economic policies that affect everyday Americans. And we should be focused on those. And, you know, the right always accuses the left of playing identity politics, but they play it much harder. So, you know, in the run-up to the 2024 election, I watched as that sort of MAGA movement really not only worked to turn out its base, but to concentrate on low-propensity voters, on young people, and on religious voters in swing states. I watched as they deployed misinformation and the politics of sort of culture war outrage to mobilize new voters to justify their vote for a corrupt and unfit candidate. But we have to remember that he won by a small margin, relatively speaking, and we need to work to win these majorities to our side.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and this is something that I've heard echoed in many places, in this encouragement to really try to set the narrative and actually make the case for more liberal values rather than be reactionary to any opinions out there that we don't like, you know.
Oh, much of the sort of moderate liberal left or whatever, I would say opposition plays right into their hands when they're like, oh, let's talk about this side issue here. No, people are having trouble affording housing. People are having trouble affording their groceries. We need to be talking about these kinds of issues. Why is life getting harder for people? Why are our schools suffering? Why is life getting more difficult for us? And focus on those issues rather than allowing us to get distracted with these shiny baubles.
Yeah, and in this attention economy, it's important to do that and not to get distracted ourselves, as you say, and to focus on that. So with all of these big challenges that you mentioned, and as you say, there's a lot that needs to be addressed. Just before we wrap up, I'd love to know, what gives you hope?
The fact that we're having this conversation gives me hope. There is no feature, again, of our system that is preventing us from speaking freely on these issues. And the people I meet who are working to preserve democracy give me hope as well. The fact that we still live in a sort of brilliantly pluralistic and diverse society with a certain measure. Listen, true religious freedom is the freedom to believe any God or sacred idea or none, right? Is the freedom from having to support any religion with your tax dollars if you don't want to. It's a freedom from having to worship if you don't want to. So we still have a measure of religious freedom in America. It's being eroded for sure, but we still have the right to free speech, the right to political activism. A lot of people are sort of shaking their heads in doom and gloom and saying democracy is over. Well, we're not quite there yet. We still have a lot of freedoms and we should exercise them and appreciate them.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for highlighting all of those as you have done. And finally, our standard closing question, Katherine, what's something which you've changed your mind on recently?
Oh, just off the top of my head, there are certain spices that I used to hate and now that I really love. Like I used to really hate anything with tarragon. Now I just think it's delicious. I don't know how that happened. If you have tarragon chicken, please send it my way and I'll gladly eat it.
Katherine Stewart, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Please remind us, when is Money, Lies and God going to be released in the US and the UK?
Thank you so much. Money, Lies and God, my newest book, comes out in the US on February 18th, and it launches in the UK in May, I believe, or April.
And we very much look forward to that, and hopefully we'll see you again. But thank you for joining us on Humanism Now.
Thank you so much.